Broadcasting from Salisbury University campus, this is WSDL Ocean City, NPR News Talk 90.7. Putting Delmarva first. Stay tuned for Delmarva Today with your host, Don Rush.
We are entering the holiday season, but there are many who will not be celebrating in the comfort of their own home. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Homelessness does not take off for the holiday. Last year, around 469,000 adults found themselves homeless nationwide. Meanwhile, an estimated 184,000 people and families found themselves without permanent shelter. It amounted to nearly 58,000 family households. Here on the Eastern Shore, various charitable organizations are gearing up for the cold temperatures of winter. And in our studio this morning is Jim Barnes. He's with the Christian Shelter here in Salisbury. Welcome to the program.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.
So what is the situation now with in terms of the homeless and what you're seeing, as particularly as we head into this cold winter season?
Well, now, overall, homelessness is steadily increasing. Our numbers increase, and also the nature of the homeless population has changed over the years. Now, we see a lot fewer single men and a lot more families, and particularly children. But this time of year, as we come into the holidays, is our slowest time of year, in the months of November and December, because there's around the holidays, there's much more sympathy out there in the general public for homeless folks. And the weather's getting cold and nasty, and so there are more resources available through churches and various philanthropic organizations out there. There's more resources for the homeless available right at this time of year. And also another interesting thing that happens around the holidays is families of folks who are homeless tend to soften their hearts during the holidays, and they will invite their wayward relatives to come and stay with them for maybe a week or two over the holidays. Of course, then after Christmas, their welcome gets worn out and they're back out there again. But so our numbers tend to go down, particularly in families, around this time of year.
So how many people come to your shelter that you have any estimate about?
Well, right now, we've got 48 homeless individuals staying in the shelter. 15 of those are men, and we have 12 women right now, and we have 21 children. That's the largest part of our population right now, which is sad at this time of year, because it's not nice to not have a home around Christmas time.
Does that have a psychological impact on people? I mean, the holidays, and as opposed to any other time of year when they're homeless? I mean, is that a reminder?
I think so. And I think it tends to lower some of the barriers a little around holidays, and people who might otherwise be a little more sober and serious about getting their lives turned around, getting jobs and all, will drift off the path and get into partying and some of that kind of thing. And for children, it generally expresses itself in a little more out of control behavior during the holidays. It's a tough time for them, because they remember things at home and a Christmas tree and presents and stuff like that. And here they are in a shelter, kind of drab shelter. And the reaction in them is to kind of get a little more rammy this time.
Yeah. So why do you think that you've seen this increase in families? Do you have any sense about that?
Yes.
What do they tell you?
Well, my standard theory on that, because I can find no other better, some practical explanation, cost of housing just keeps going up. And rental housing, especially in this area, with a lot of retirees and the student population growing, why a lot of rental housing gets taken up by people who do have reasonable means. And so the price of that rental housing tends to steadily go up. people with low incomes, whose incomes are not going up, begin to get screened out of the picture, and particularly families and single-parent families with children that are struggling right on the margin anyway. And those factors are still very much present, and the numbers seem to be growing.
I mean, we're sitting in an economy that, at least from statistically speaking, we're somewhere between 3% and 4% unemployment. Which is almost virtually full employment under standard economic analysis. But yet, the people seem to still be struggling. Do you have any sense about why that is? I mean, is it just simply that
there are more jobs available? No, I think it's mostly on the cost of housing side where the crunch comes, because there are jobs available.
Are they just so low service jobs? I mean, low wage service?
Well, for many of our folks, the folks that we see at the shelter, yeah, that's true, because they have relatively limited education and fairly limited job experience, and so they're confined to lower echelon. Although even the chicken plants have been raising salaries, and they've gotten salaries up to a pretty decent place. But I think it's the cost of housing is the big factor. You get a little more income, but the rental goes up faster than the income.
So how do you, at this shelter, how do you then accommodate families? And because obviously you still have single men there. Do you have, like, women with the families? Is that the predominant
that's the predominant picture, is single mothers with families. We've increased the number of family spaces in the shelter. We've had to do some construction changes in the shelter, and now we have 13 rooms that are devoted to families, and these are rooms that usually will contain 4 to 6 beds, and have have their own bathroom, shower facility is connected right there in the room. So the families they're not too bad. They're relatively comfortable situation, and like I say, we've increased the number of those. We've converted storage space into family rooms, so we've got 13 of those family rooms now.
But that just seems like a small number of places compared to what I'm sure must be the demand.
Yeah.
I mean,
well,
are there like a lot of others, or
Well, actually, over the so far this year, why we've been having to turn a lot of people away just because there's no room. And we're coming into the time of year that's the hardest thing about my job, is especially when the weather's bad and you have a mother with several small children come to the door in the evening and say, can we stay here? We have no place to go. And everything's full, and you got to look at them, and geez, sometimes they got melting snow dripping off their heads, and soaking wet and miserable looking, and you have to look at them and say, "I'm sorry, but I've got no beds, no rooms. It's all full."
Is there any way to help them, to send them to somewhere else?
Yeah. Almost for us now, we can't send them to a motel because we don't have the funds to do that. But we can, social services, particularly when there's children involved, social services, they do have some funding available to put people in motels if that's the only resource, or we can make referrals to there's another shelter in town, and there are a couple of shelters outside of town, one down in Ocean City and one in Pocomoke, that we can refer folks to. But generally, there are emergency resources available if there's no place for them to go and the weather's bad out there. And there's children involved, social services will get them a place.
You were looking at something there?
Well, I was looking at the numbers. So far in this year, we've housed a total of 760 people, and we've turned away about 600. So we've turned away almost as many people as we've housed, just because there's not enough room.
So, if these people can't find some option with, say, social services or some of the other shelters or whatever, where does that leave? What kind of experience is it like then?
Well, alternatives that they face, and this is true, I think, probably for many people. Live in a car or a van, double up, and this is more frequently the case, is just find a relative or a friend out there who has a place and double up with them and sleep on the floor or on couches. And when you're talking about children, this is a difficult situation, but yeah, those are the kinds of alternatives that people will take if there just isn't shelter space.
So we were talking a bit about the impact, particularly on children. I noticed something like, I think it's something like 292,000 of the homeless folks nationwide, I think it was last year, were children. And of those, 144,000 were actually under the age of 6. What kind of impact does that have on children, particularly emotionally and behavior-wise?
I think the studies show that the impact is tremendous. Academic achievement in schools is lower for folks for homeless kids. Family disruption and brokenness is increased with homeless kids, less stable family settings and all, more behavioral problems, and ultimately further down the line, more involvement in criminal activity and more likely to be sentenced to prison eventually, to end up in jail or in difficulty with the law. So there's a lot of negative impacts on kids who, especially at a fairly young age. And of course, the other impact that we see is the cyclical nature of the thing. If kids grow up in homeless situations, they tend to be less stable when they get married. And particularly, a mother starts having children in the lower income brackets, maybe at age 16, 17 years old. Well, her children are going to inherit a sense of instability and maybe some of the same behavioral patterns, seeking immediate gratification instead of long-term planning and that kind of thing, that leads to, as those kids grow up and they become 16 and they get married and they start having children. And it's much more likely that the children of homeless folks are going to end up being homeless themselves and their children homeless. And there's a multiplying effect that it's not just a single arithmetic multiple, it's a geometric multiple that goes on that says 5-10 years down the line, the homeless population is going to be increased by a fairly substantial amount.
So if people can't find shelter, particularly single, but where do they go? Do they do bridges? What is that typical day like then for them?
Gee, that's hard to say. There are those, and it's more likely to be single men that are homeless more or less by lifestyle choice. Some of those lifestyle choices are not as easy to pinpoint, but for example, you get a guy who comes along and he comes out of a relatively unstable home himself, and the job alternatives for him, if he hasn't finished a high school education, are places like chicken factories, and that's hard work, and the pay isn't all that high. And in the chicken factories particularly, that kind of work, hard physical labor kind of things, doing a job as a roofer in the winter when you're out there in the cold. By the end of the week, you're tired and cold and miserable and aching all over, and your little paycheck is about $300 or something like that at the end of the week, and the landlord's going to grab up most of that. and you turn around and you see your friend who doesn't work and hangs on the corner, and he can make $200-300 in a couple of hours selling drugs or whatever on the corner, and you're making your little $300 once a week and breaking your back for it. Why, that could tend to discourage you, make you think twice about, well, maybe I don't want to work. Maybe I want to hang on the corner and get that easy money, so in those situations, well, those folk can make pretty good money. Even the guys that stand on the corners with the signs that say "Help me, I'm homeless," they can pull in $50 to $100 a day, just collecting money out in the street. And that gives them enough money to rent a cheap motel room for the night. And of course, in a motel room, they've got TV, and it's not too bad, and it's warm in there. But there are folks who are homeless by choice and won't settle down enough, won't even be able to stay in shelters very long. They'll get kicked out because of behavior patterns that are disruptive and create problems in the shelter. And those folk tend to live many of them live outdoors in camps, and there are encampments of homeless folks around the city and in various places. They get rousted every once in a while if they get pretty noisy or obnoxious out there. Well, they'll get rousted and they'll move on to some other location.
Let me ask you this, because I would think that being homeless and that just sheer lack of certainly mental activity in terms of generally speaking, that you're just out there and you're certainly exposed to the elements, even whether it's the summer or the winter, that's got to have some kind of psychological numbing effect on someone, that if you spend 6 months or a year out there on the street, it's going to affect you mentally as well as physically in terms of how you relate to people and society in general. I mean, it sounds to me like it should have some effect in and of itself.
Well, maybe, but chances are that a lot of those people that are experiencing that kind of, and that's not a huge population, but that are living on the street, as it were, from hand to mouth. I don't know whether the chicken comes first or the egg comes first. Whether the lack of mental stimulation was there before they became homeless and then it contributed to their homelessness, or whether it's a product of being homeless. I had a friend in New York City one time who came he was a graduate student in college, and as part of his coursework, he was doing research on homelessness, and so he chose to spend, I think, about a month on the street in New York City, homeless. He came. We were running a shelter there, and he came in and left his belongings with us and said, "I'm just going out there with no money and one set of raggedy clothes, and I'm going to find out what it's like out there." And he came back to us at the end of his time, 2 or 3 weeks. He came back and said, and kind of talked with us a bit about his experience out there. And he said that food was no problem on the street. You can always get food. If need be, you just find the dumpsters behind a restaurant and dig stuff out of there. But mostly you can bum food back in the kitchen door of most restaurants. You can pick up enough food to survive on. Okay. And even camping out on the street, you can find places where the rain doesn't get on you, and you can curl up and sleep for a little bit. He said the biggest thing is fear. The worst thing about being out there on the street is fear. And of course, I suppose, because fear of somebody else who's in the same state you are coming along and beating you on the head or lighting your cardboard box on fire or who knows what. And that it's dangerous out there in the street, which is one of the things that we try to counteract in the shelter by creating an atmosphere where the fear is minimized, where there's a sense of order and peacefulness and calm inside that shelter, so that people can begin to relax a little bit and let down a little bit and begin to think a little bit about their own life. Where am I going and what is my life about anyway? Because while you're out there on the street, yeah, there's not much time to do any long-term planning or thinking about your life. It's mostly scrabbling just to get by for one more day.
So what role do things like alcohol and drug addiction play in all of this? I mean, that obviously is the stereotypical image that we certainly have of folks who wind up homeless. What kind of role does that play?
They're in the mix. They're very much in the mix. I would say probably between 30 and 40% of the folk who come into the shelter are involved with, in some way, with drugs or alcohol, and we monitor that very carefully because that can be a very dangerous thing. But there was a time that went. There was kind of a lull. Crack cocaine was the biggest thing, and drug thing. But more recently, in the last couple of years, why heroin is back in big force, and the over prescription of painkillers. Yeah. Oh boy, that's been a brutal thing. That gets people hooked, and then the cost of prescription drugs gets to be very, very high to buy it in the drugstore, and they find that they can get the same or better pain relief for much less money by buying street drugs and getting into that. And that's, geez, the street thing, and especially heroin, has increased markedly in the last couple of 3 years, and that is a problem. And in the shelter, we just can't allow drug use to go on with folks staying in the shelter, because it becomes a danger to everybody, and particularly children that are in that shelter. So we're very strict about that, and we do drug testing and alcohol testing in the shelter on a regular basis. And if somebody is using drugs, and particularly if they bring any of it into the shelter, why, that's it. They've got to go. We can't have that danger in there.
So if they have this problem, where can they go?
Well, the rehab programs, the hospital, PRMC has a whole unit for detoxification, and they refer people out to various drug rehab programs. What I like to refer people to is the long-term Christian rehab programs, the Teen Challenge type programs, because they're so very, very effective, and they really, if you complete one of those programs, your likelihood of going back into drugs again is a lot slimmer than doing a 28-day, behavioral modification kind of program. But there are resources for that.
So, what do you think we should be doing as a society, particularly in a governmental level, that we're not doing for homelessness?
Well,
I mean, there's a policy, but I mean, I'll ask.
I believe legislation that supports and encourages the strengthening of families. We've tended to get kind of casual government-wise and say, well, it takes a village to raise a child, and the government can do it. And so we create programs to take the place of parents and a home, and even create legislation that discourages parents from staying together and keeping homes intact. And that's, my sense is that we need to reverse that. And then the other tendency of government has been to discourage and try to stamp out religion. But anything that has to do with God, look out, man, that's no good. And keep it out of the schools, and keep it out of the public discourse. And you can penalize somebody that turns out to be prey much, that kind of stuff. And that's, see, those are the two greatest resources that people who are struggling, low-income folks who are struggling and run into a real hard time in their lives, the two best resources they've got is, number one, faith in God, and number two, family, some kind of somebody to come alongside them, and family, and help hold things together. And as we eliminate those in terms of the way governments operate, the more we eliminate things like family and God, the more we create a society where somebody who's struggling doesn't have a solid thing to turn to, and they tend to fall apart. And in fact, a large percentage of people that we see at the shelter have mental health problems and bring with them bags full of very strong antipsychotic medications that just make it almost impossible for them to function, to get back to functioning steadily, seriously, reliably in job settings, in education, and homes. And I don't see any quick, easy answers. The picture is a little bit grim and discouraging, at least for the immediate future, because we seem to be moving further and further in the direction of a society with no norms, fewer and fewer, no morality, no standards, no firm standards. Everything's just, whatever you think is right, it's got to be right. And that creates a setting where there's a lot of instability, and you end up, and I think we're going to continue to see growing number of folks who are homeless.
Well, I maybe alluded to this, but why do you think that there is this sort of atomization, I guess, for lack of a better word, of the family? I mean, at one time, particularly certainly from the beginning of the founding of the country till certainly the 20th century, the extended family was the sort of safety net. That you obviously didn't. I mean, you needed programs, obviously, and for instance, when the immigrants came in the late 1800s, you had state agencies that had to deal with this, and obviously in the 1930s we had the feds. But we don't seem to have that extended sense of family anymore. We're all scattered out from, my relatives in Kentucky and California and Florida. Yeah. And so, I mean, we're not centrally located, say, for instance, we once were, where, the guy down the road, I know him or he's a relative. I mean, there seems to be this sort of breakup just from a social and economic standpoint. We just sort of divide it up.
Well, and a family is hard work. It's not an easy thing. It's relationships that are tough. And we've seemed to have given up on hard work in our society. Anything that causes pain or it causes hard work and stress, you want to avoid. Take pills or whatever, you knock down a couple of drinks, but let's not put ourselves in a situation where we may experience a little pain and we may have to struggle and work hard.
Do you think that our modern age, particularly in the 21st century, has been the social media and so on and so forth, in which we don't even see each other, we communicate? I mean, do you think that has the impact?
Big factor. The fact that in order to be totally entertained these days, why, it's all right in your living room. You've got all these wonderful sound systems and visual systems, and you don't even have to go out the door. I think communication, the art of communication, is a lost art nowadays, because you get these cell phones, a little thing you carry around in your hand that can do almost anything. And that tends to discourage development of relationships and the ability to communicate effectively with one another. You have one of these little phones, you just have a few code words, and that's all you need to know. You don't need to know language anymore. So these are things that I think these are parts of our society that break down and isolate us. We live in much more isolation today than we ever used to. But that seems to be a natural product of progress. So we're progressing marvelously towards chaos.
You think there's anything we can do about that?
One by one.
By
how you make choices and decisions and how a parent raises their kids. to make choices and decisions. I think that's the level on which the change has to occur.
We've been speaking with Jim Barnes. He's with the Christian Shelter here in Salisbury, Maryland, and taking in the homeless. And, of course, we should remember them, particularly during these cold winter times, but also perhaps when it's not so cold as well. Appreciate you stopping by and chatting with us.
Thank you very much.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for watching Delmarva Today, a production of Delmarva Public Radio. Production and audio engineering by Chris Rank. Hosted by Don Rush. For podcasts, visit delmarvapublicradio.net or subscribe to the Delmarva Today podcast on iTunes. Delmarva Today can now be seen on Pack 14.